Celeste and Amor Towles, two phenomenal authors together. They wanted to be partnered for this, and it's an exclusive. This is the only event that's scheduled for them to do together. So far, at least. I don't know if they really hit it off tonight. They may just take the show on the road. When their most recent books were first published 2 or 3 years ago, we hosted each author separately here in DC. But now the books are out in paperback, which gives us another opportunity to celebrate their work. Now, how many of you have already read Celeste's Little Fires Everywhere or Amor's A Gentleman in Moscow? It's quite a few. Well, it's not surprising that many of you are already familiar, since both novels were bestsellers and won lots of critical acclaim. And now both are set to become series on TV. For those of you who haven't yet read them or need a quick refresher, here are a couple of very brief descriptions, no spoilers. Little Fires Everywhere is a complex, entertaining suburban saga set in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and centered on the intertwined fates of two families. Nuanced, multi-layered, and thought-provoking, the story explores motherhood, race, class, and the risk of sometimes strictly adhering to rules. A Gentleman in Moscow features a Russian count, a man of considerable refinement and charm, who a few years after the Russian Revolution is sentenced to spend the rest of his life inside a luxury hotel in Moscow. The book follows the Count over the next several decades as he makes the most of his confined existence, interacting with some colorful characters and bearing witness to his era. Both of these books were second novels, and they came after very impressive successes that Celeste and Amor had with their debut works. In Celeste's case, Everything I Never Told You, and in Amor's, it was Rules of Civility. Each of these authors took a different route to their writing careers. Amor first had a lucrative run in finance before leaving that to write fiction full-time. Celeste launched on her author path while still in her 20s, attending a graduate program in creative writing not long after college. Oh, and another huge divergence between them. Celeste went to Harvard and Amor to Yale. And while the type of fiction they've produced markedly differs from each other, they've had similar impacts on us as readers, leaving us marveling at their writing skills, feeling fully engaged in their stories, and enhancing our own views of humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both Celeste and Amor Towles.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. So this is the first time we've met once before.
Like in passing, at a luncheon where we were all supposed to talk to.
Yeah, we weren't allowed to talk to each other.
Yeah.
It was like speed dating with bookstore people.
That's exactly what it's like. We had to circulate around the tables.
Yeah. So the only thing you weren't allowed to do was talk to another author while you were there. You're supposed to be talking to everybody else. So this is kind of like the first time we met. But so this is really fun for us. So if we start having more fun than you, I'm sorry. There's a risk of that. Can I start?
Sure.
So we're going to ask questions from each other, and then we're going to, so you guys can ask questions of the two of us.
So think of your questions now. Start now. Thank you.
So, and actually, I want to ask two back to back, because they're because I think one might follow the other. So the first thing I want to ask you about is it's really about your two novels. We both have two novels.
Yeah.
Is one of the interesting aspects about both of them is that they really make the most of investigating the nuclear family, for a lack of a better term, right? If we think of a family of four, there's actually 6 pairings in a family of 4. If you look at each relationship, and if you got a family of 5, it's 10 different relationships which are in play. And you do such a lovely job in both books of kind of investigating how, the daughter to mother, daughter to son, daughter to, or daughter to brother, how each of those relationships sort of varies within the household. It's the same household, with in theory kind of the same information, the same relationships, but all this chemistry happening. And so I'm kind of intrigued by your what kind of led you to the investigation of kind of the nuclear family as a topic.
Well, I think I've always been drawn to writing about families because they're such a fundamental relationship for us. They really shape us into who we are. And one of the things that I love about the nuclear family, too, is that, as you said, there are all these sort of different alliances and allegiances that happen, and they shift. They shift over time. Sometimes they shift over the course of a conversation or the course of a Thanksgiving dinner. When I look back on my childhood, I have 2 parents and I have an older sister who's quite a bit older than I am. And so, as a result, we were never at the same stage of life at the same time. And so we essentially had almost 2 completely different family experiences. So when my sister was born, my parents were very new immigrants. They were grad students. They were living in grad student housing. They didn't have family nearby. They were kind of figuring out what they were doing. When I came around, my parents had finished their PhDs and had, stable jobs. They had bought a house. They had already, raised 1 child to the age of 11. And so a lot of times when I talk to my sister now, I realize how we almost have 2 separate sets of parents. We had such different experiences. And she'll say, Mom always is into doing this thing. I'm like, is she? Does she do that? And part of that is because we had these really different experiences growing up. And I'm sort of fascinated by the way that we can have, we can share half of our DNA. Theoretically, we were raised by the same 2 people, and yet we are very different from each other. And I grew up with friends who came out of big families, and I would see them over the course of, one afternoon. Some of them, it's the girls against the boys, and then it's these 2, the oldest kids, against all the others, and then it's, someone with their mom against everybody else. And that kind of shifting constellation is just really fascinating, and that's why I came to do it.
And one of the things that happens in your books that's related to that is that, of course, you can have different confidants and have different levels of perception. So what they know about each other is also different. I understand your point is very well put about how the family and the space evolves over time. So some say each kid growing up in a different family, but then each person in the family seems to have a different perception of who the other member of the family is.
Yeah, I have a very good friend who is a therapist, actually, and she works with children and adolescents, and she says that you actually have a different relationship with a different member of the family, and they see you as a different person. And that makes so much sense to me, because the person that you are when you're with, let's say, your partner, is not usually the same person that you are when you're with a very good friend or a work acquaintance. And who you are sort of shifts as you meet different people and depending on the context. And that's something that I've been very aware of myself for various reasons, that there's this sort of tonal shifting or code switching that happens, not only in terms of the language you use, but in terms of how you act, what your bearing is. I think the first time that my mother came to see me at a book event, she had this sort of moment of like, who is this person? And the same thing, I did an event fairly recently, which my mother-in-law came to, and I was so grateful that she came, but usually we see her at holiday meals and things like that, and I'm with my son, her grandson, and she sees me in family mode. And she came to this dinner, and then the event afterwards, at which there were 700 people. And she saw me kind of in what I think of as work mode. And I think she was startled, not in a bad way, but just like, I didn't know you could do that. I chose to take that as a compliment. Listen, let me turn the question around.
Wait, no, I didn't have my second question.
I thought those were the 2.
That was kind of let's put that one in there.
This is like an extra, bonus question.
So the second question, which is the related one, is because I think you and I share this, and maybe this is just general, maybe we all share this, but I think that we're both very interested in objects and the power of objects in family or in relationships or in memory or in anything, And I like 2 of my favorite from your first book are, for those who have read it, are the cookbook that the mother goes back to her mother after she's died and rediscovers this cookbook that defines so much about...
It tells her so much about who her mother was.
And as a result, who she was raised to be, in this very potent way. And is it Betty Crocker? I mean,
Yeah,
which of course I grew up with one in my house, so it also is that. But and then she then gives to her daughter diaries year after year after year, and I don't want to discovers something about these diaries many years later than the mother does. And both of those are just great sort of objects in how they contain emotions and expectations and memory. So, but I want before you tell me about your thoughts about objects, I wanted to. So I ran across this. Celeste uses Twitter very effectively to communicate and to kind of be involved in engagements. And so I was kind of watching, kind of Celeste feed, and I don't even remember how this started, but the thing was, I think somebody says, if you could do anything, what would you do? And this is what your answer was. I would make a huge dollhouse, like Queen Mary's dollhouse, only better, obviously, where everything worked. Lights, water, actual words inside books, and just making more rooms and fully equipped workroom where I could make many things for the house. And I was like, wow. So because on the one hand, I'm admiring your use of objects in your narratives as a form of sort of creative information. But on the other hand, then there was this revelation of you being obsessed with dollhouses, and then you even talk in the following tweet that you made miniature objects as a child.
I had a sort of
so where does this all come from?
So actually, even aside from making dollhouse things as a kid, I had a sort of side little job as a miniaturist when I was in college and then in grad school. I would make, this was in sort of the early days of the internet when there were websites, but not everybody knew how to have a website, where I would make scale miniature foods and I would sell them to collectors. And that was how I got sort of extra money.
For dollhouses?
For dollhouses or for miniature dioramas. There's this sort of niche culture which I think has become more mainstream now. There's sort of a real interest in tiny things.
That are perfectly made, though.
So if any of you are on Instagram, there are a lot of accounts where they show, miniature food or miniature tiny furniture where they're like, here's a tiny miniature iPhone, little chat messages on it. There are a few feeds where they show people making real miniature food. So they might make pancakes. So they'll get a very small bowl and they put a little bit of flour, then they get a quail egg and they crack the quail egg and they whisk it with a tiny whisk and then they light a little candle. It's really mesmerizing and I highly recommend that. And if you are bored at work or anything like that, just do a Google search for this. But I think that there's something about the physical object that we tend to kind of overlay all of these feelings and emotions onto it. We tend to make them significant. This is now, I guess, the age of Marie Kondo, where we're kind of having to have this moment of reckoning, where some of us are. I have not Marie Kondo'd anything in my life, but where you have to kind of reckon with your attachment to an object. And I think part of the resistance to the Marie Kondo method, where she says, just get rid of it if it doesn't spark joy, is that for a lot of people, we have emotional attachments to our objects. And I think what she's saying is maybe some of those are not healthy. But it's true that, if you have had the experience of going through your old room, maybe if you're, someone in your family was cleaning out their house, or someone's belongings after they've passed away, or just when you're moving, you see objects and they sort of act as these sort of Proustian Madeleines that remind you, oh yeah, okay, that was the time that we were doing this. One of my few recurring dreams is that I have to clean out my old room in my childhood home, which is something I've already done, and I didn't remember it being that fraught. But I frequently remember, and it's actually my old room. It's not, just a room that I think is my room. And I'm pulling out all these objects and I'm trying to figure out what they are. And so I think for me, a lot of time the object can be this very nice sort of stand-in that unlocks a lot of emotions for a character. Because when you see something that belong to you or belong to someone else, and it doesn't have to be anything important. It could be a ticket stub, it could be a pencil stub, it could be whatever. You have invested it with all of this sort of emotion, and for a writer, I feel like that's a really useful tool to have. So now it's my turn, because I feel like I could ask you similar questions that I want to know, as I really enjoyed A Gentleman in Moscow. I feel like one of the things that I loved about it that was sort of unusual is that it was in some ways, it was about almost like a found family, that you've got this, this young count who enters, doesn't spoil anything for any of you who haven't, are there people who haven't read your book?
I'm sure.
I feel like there cannot, like, you may have run through the entire population at this point. But, that he's sentenced to house arrest in this really beautiful hotel, and he's supposed to spend the rest of his life there, and what he finds is that he starts making these sort of relationships and alliances with people who are there in this really beautiful way. He becomes part of this, sort of this triumvirate of men where they have their own secret plans to do things just to bring themselves joy. He, to his surprise, strikes up a friendship with a little girl in the hotel, and then that turns out to have huge consequences for him later in life. He creates this sort of family for himself of the people who are around him. And I'm curious, what led you to, was there a reason that you started writing the book about this man who starts off, he's almost sort of standing alone. We first meet him in this trial where he's on trial for possibly being, I guess, a reactionary. And he's kind of all alone. And by the end of the book, again, without giving anything away, he's formed this huge network of people who have enriched his life and will turn out to help him in really important ways.
Yeah. So I'm working on my third book right now, and if you look at Rules of Civility for A Gentleman in Moscow, or my third book, which I'm working on, all the main characters, their mothers died or ran away when they were young. And I don't know what that means. I probably should talk to your friend, the therapist, or whatever. But there is something about it, apparently, and I haven't really thought about it, self-consciously, but this quasi-orphan is, at any age, is interesting to me. And I guess it's partly because of that. It's sort of like, it's the Big Bang. It's dark matter. It's this density that suddenly that I can take it anywhere I want, in any direction. And there may be sort of memories in the past, but I don't have to sort of drag myself or the reader or my character through all this contemporary relationships. I can build the relationships instead. And that's very much a part of Rules of Civility. It's about a young woman making relationships for the first time as a young adult. And as you say, that's true of Gentleman in Moscow. And that must be what it is the freedom it gives me to kind of construct around that.
Well, this is I think it's kind of a trend not a trend, it's a long-standing trope in literature that often there are characters who kind of show up and in a way their past is, it's not a blank slate, but their parents are not there. They don't have to go visit their parents. Their parents are not around bothering them. I think when I was a kid and we would play pretend games, the first thing that you always had to do when you were playing these games was figure out what happened to your parents. How do you get the parents off the stage? And I remember reading in a children's book too, I think it was maybe by Beverly Cleary or somebody like that, where they say, this is the first rule, which is like, okay, if you don't want to kill off the parents, your parents have gone to town and they've left you at home and there's a snowstorm that's come up, and that's why you have no parents. And in some ways, I think it does give you that freedom to sort of create all the rest of the stuff without the parents being there. Maybe that's part of it.
And that must be it. So I'm stuck with it. I don't know. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you also about the objects, because you've also got objects in A Gentleman in Moscow. There's a portrait. There are certain objects that come. There's a key that provides plot value, but also a lot of symbolic value. And so my question is sort of, how did you come to those objects? Because I know that when I'm writing, I don't always plan, but you've got such an intricately plotted book that I wonder how you decided which objects to use, and then how did you manage to weave them through? And this is where I'm just like, tell me all your secrets.
Yeah, okay. So let me say, first of all, that ever since I was a kid, I loved the cabinet of curiosities. That's the 19th century, 18th century, I guess even earlier, but that notion that in the 18th century, the sophisticated person might have a room where you had, dinosaur bones and stuffed fish and
fossils.
Yes, fossils and all kinds of artifacts. You could have paintings, you could have portraits, you could have gems, but the idea was because before museums, and the Cabinet of Curiosities in many ways became the precursor to the modern version of the museum that we have here in New York, and so but it was all in one room. And the shelves, the cubby holes, so you could kind of, from floor to ceiling, on this wall, sea life, and on this wall, bird life, and, on this wall, minerals, or what have you. And there's something so compelling about that. And so I do think that I'm attracted to that as a narrative device. You know what I mean? This idea that the book could be, that a book could contain all kinds of aspects of life. You know, music and food and allusions to history and allusions to other literature, as well as the individual experiences of the characters. And that the book is like a cabinet of curiosities, so that you can kind of enter it and change what you're looking at any given time, and open it and study a different aspect of the interaction. But so then you get down to the really particular stuff, which you're asking about, which is, and I guess what I would say is, for me, I am an outliner. I'm a very detailed outliner. I will design a book for a year and outline it for another year before I write chapter 1, and so I kind of know a great deal about what's in it. And I was very self-conscious early on that kind of aware that A Gentleman in Moscow is kind of like a diamond on its side. And then it kind of starts with this pinpoint of individual with no background, as you say, gets sentenced into a hotel, walks through door, and then it kind of starts going like this, where you encounter, different people in the hotel, different rooms in the hotel, objects.
Yeah, there's a period where I think there's a character who's literally taking him on a tour of the hotel,
right.
and opening up all these worlds that he thought he knew the whole hotel, and actually there's this whole part he didn't know. And
that's this part of the book, and then kind of around 200, or something like that, 100, it starts to go like this, and I wanted it to kind of all come swirling together, and so I was very aware of that the objects in that first half. I wanted them to play a role, and some of that I kind of knew from day one. Like, this is definitely going to be, whatever. Twice-tolling clock is going to reappear in this fashion at different times and play this role. In some cases, it's a discovery during the writing process. So there's a silly example in a way, but I know in my outline that the count at a certain point a disguise is going to be needed by a character, not the count. And so I kind of know that. It's in the outline and when it's going to be needed and why it's going to be needed. And early on in the book, the Count goes into a barbershop. And he's just sort of admiring the barbershop, and he sees this glass case. He's kind of talking about how great the old barber was because this case is filled with all these wonderful, potions or shampoos or colognes and all these kinds of things from France and Italy. And as I'm kind of writing it, I'm kind of down the list of the things, and then there's this little bottle of black, which in essence is dye that the barber used to call the fountain of youth. To use it to, in essence, dye men's mustaches. But as soon as I was writing that, I'm like, of course, that's perfect. That's going to come back, and play this role. I know in the outline is going to be disguise. Well, that's going to be a part of it. So then I kind of go, even though I'm in chapter 2 or whatever, I go to my outline and I add that element in. So kind of as I'm writing the first half of the book, the outline in the second half is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah. As it contains all these things that I'm planning to use.
It's such a good feeling though, and I'm so glad to hear you say that happen because that happens to me too. And where there's this moment where you feel like the book is telling you how to write it.
Yes.
Where it's a friend of mine, Michael Byers, who's a novelist, says that there's a time where the book takes on a life of its own, and it really tries to help you, and it will remind you of the fireman brother that you made in chapter 2 on a whim when you have a fire in chapter 8, and it will remind you of the ballerina here, right, when you need a ballerina there, and it's a sort of lovely feeling of like, this is all actually finally working together.
Yeah, and some of that is as you say, is a gift of the writing process to you, where you're like, this is happening, and I want to make the most of that or take advantage of that. And sometimes it's totally, you don't recognize it. Yeah. It's happening under the surface, and one of the sort of the most enjoyable parts of the end of the writing process for me is you get to your copy editing. Yeah. And I'll be like, I need to find that sentence where, the character puts his bag on his shoulder. This is like literally something from Rules of Civility. That's what it was. Like, put something on his shoulder. And I'm like, I'll just search for shoulder because it'll find it like that. And it turned out like 10 different times in the book does a character put something on his shoulder. I'm like, what does that mean?
It is a sort of subconscious wish. My characters are always standing in the doorway for whatever reason. And the copy editor's whole job is to go through your manuscript and kind of fix up all your mistakes. And they will say, you said that it was Wednesday on this day, but actually it has to be Tuesday. And she'll say, consider having a character not stand in the doorway. I should consider that.
I'm like doubling down, right?
I like your analogy. I like your analogy into the cabinet of curiosities because I'm also fascinated by them, and I'm fascinated just by the idea of curation and sort of what that says, because one of the things that I find really interesting about the cabinet of curiosities is that even though it's supposed to be everything, if you look at it in the aggregate, it starts to tell you something about the person who's put those things together. Right?
Sure, absolutely.
It tells you something about what
it's
they're interested
biographical in this weird way.
Exactly, and they don't necessarily mean to tell you those things, and they may not even know those things about themselves, but by virtue of the things that they're putting in, you get a sense of the individual who collected it, right? And you're reminded that this is a particular person's sort of cabinet, right? Like everyone's cabinet of curiosities would be different.
Yes.
And I mean, the same is true of museum exhibits as well, which I think is fascinating. But I feel like in thinking about, a book as a cabinet of curiosities, it's sort of like that, right? We have these sort of ticks that we put in. What does it mean that, your characters are always putting something on their shoulder? What does it mean that mine are always standing in the doorway? There must be something about that it tells us.
No question, and I trust in that. I think that's because my experience as a critical reader, we were both English majors, right? I that you were. So we spent our lives analyzing somebody else's book and how it functions, how it makes its points, how the themes develop, how it affects you emotionally. And one of the ways you do that is by discovering a thread of imagery that is resonating chapter to chapter, and kind of in this amorphous way that accumulates in some kind of meaning.
Yeah.
That's part of the thing. And so I love that when I discovered in my own work, you have to hope that your subconscious is working that well, that it is throwing things in there that can resonate later for a reader.
For me, I think writing is often it's sort of this act of faith, and I was not raised religiously, but there is this sort of trust that you have that your subconscious is doing these things for a reason, and you're like, I will just go with you for a while and find it. I mean, for me, I think it's almost a pattern recognition in a way, sort of what you're saying, that you're seeing, these things keep happening, that must be what I'm writing the book about.
Right.
I'm curious,
and obviously in Little Fires,
yeah.
and I talk about it as the self-conscious motifs and the unconscious motifs, and both will exist in the book. Like the fire, I assume, is a self-conscious motif, in more, relatively speaking.
It became one.
Yeah, right. Once you realize it's there.
Once I started, I actually did not realize that, and the book actually was not titled Little Fires Everywhere. When I gave it to my agent, I think it had some other title on it because she told me that I couldn't give her any more manuscripts that said title goes here, which is usually what I do. Titles always come last for me. And, she said, why don't you go through the whole book and write down any phrase that you think might make a good title. So I went through and I had about 3 pages, and actually what I ended up with, what we both liked, was Little Fires Everywhere. And the more I thought about it, the more I went, there are fires. Like there are little fires, but there are
sparks,
also and sparks and heat and energy and different things. And at that point, I kind of realized, this has been a theme that I've been weaving in, and then I had to go back in and make sure that, there were parts where there wasn't any fire, and then there were parts where there was too much fire, and I had to kind of clean it out. But it was one of those cases for me where I was like, good job, subconscious.
Yeah. and what's interesting to me about, and I'll make this isn't in your book, you have used a different metaphor, but I'm going to add one, which is I guess the jack pine out west, is the famous pine tree that it needs a forest fire to release the seeds from the pine cone. That's the way they work. The resin is so tight on the cone.
That it needs that heat,
it will never release a seed, and more trees will grow unless it has a forest fire. And so, you kind of use the prairie fire as your version of that in Little Fires. But the reason I mention it is because I feel like the fire is quite a natural for you, because in both books, I feel like there is this kind of concept of this notion of sometimes, maybe particularly in a family, you need some kind of conflagration to shake the thing up so that positive things can happen. And maybe that's particularly true for the teenagers in both of your books, because your books do have teenagers seeking freedom.
I think it's true for the whole family structure, because sort of the longer that I continue to have a family, and sort of the more sort of family gatherings I go to, and the more my family's at the point now where there are often 3 generations. So there will be my parents and sort of my generation, and then our kids. I'm still friends with people that I knew when we were younger, and I see their parents, and so I've seen this family relationship over a long period. And it strikes me how little that changes. You go to Thanksgiving dinner or something, and everyone immediately snaps back into their family roles, right? There's the person who, of course, you were going to forget to do the thing that you're supposed to do, and of course you're on the ball. And meanwhile, this person is here. The dynamics are so deeply ingrained that it strikes me often that I think you often, change is hard, and you need something really big to kind of shake you out of that. You need something that almost is out of your control, whether it is a tragedy, as it often is for people, or an illness, or some really huge life-shattering event before you can really break out of that. Yeah. I think it's your turn to ask a question.
Oh, good. Yeah. So this is kind of a weird one, but this is related, which is So in reading both of the books, one of the things that struck me is constantly, I don't mean in a negative way, but frequently, something really intense is going on in a car.
Yeah.
It's constantly happening. So it's like, and at first I was like, I think that in both books there's a young woman who is learning to drive.
Yes.
Right? So in one case she's trying to get her, she goes, fails her test, but that's related to the fact she witnesses something in her car with her dad, which unsettles her.
Yeah.
And you have at the heart of Little Fires Everywhere, you have this wonderful character, Mia, who says, take nothing with you, leave nothing with behind, just leave it all behind. And that's the life she leads, except in one thing, which is her car, which was from her brother, which she keeps, and it means something very important to her.
Yeah.
And there's, so I was kind of fascinated by, as someone who's writing very subtly about the nuances of domestic life, like we've been talking about. Is the car kind of this sort of in-between transformative space, which is kind of like family space, but on the other hand, it's also a route to freedom, potentially.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. I mean,
there's sex in the cars, people get drunk in the cars,
people
run away in the cars, there's a lot of things happening in the
I
cars.
think there's something to that, especially for the teenagers, because I think when you're a teenager, the car is sort of the first independent space that you have. When you get your own car, that is a huge thing, right? If you're so lucky as to have your own car to be able to drive, you can then go places, and you're able to put distance between you and your home, right, your family. It is, for a lot of people, the space, at least in my teenagers, where people would drink or smoke or have sex. This is places where it's a space that's sort of self-contained, that isn't your house, it isn't your school. It's sort of portable. It's like this little pocket bubble that you can take with you. And I think there is something to that. It's also, though, it's a confined space. It's small. It's if you've ever slept overnight in a car, you know how constraining that can be. And it does function sort of as this crucible that intensifies things. I feel like many of the very intense conversations that I've had in my life have happened in cars. And I think there's a reason for that. This actually is advice in parenting. We were talking about kids backstage, and I've heard this advice, and I tucked it away for when my child gets to teenage years.
Yes.
That a lot of times, if you need to talk to them about something, go on a really long drive, because you're stuck with each other. There's nothing that you can do. It's a little different in the age of smartphones now, maybe, but you also, I was told that it's really helpful because you don't have to look at each other. You're not at the table, and in some ways it's easier to talk about things when you are quite literally looking in the same direction. You're next to each other, but there's no expectation of eye contact because one of you theoretically is driving the car. Right? And there's a great Joyce Carol Oates story that I think is called Shopping Trip, which I read when I was about 15, and it was almost painful to me because it struck so close to home. But it's about a mother and a daughter who go on a shopping trip, and actually I think the entire story takes place in the car. I don't think they actually ever managed to complete the shopping trip, but everything between them comes out in this really fierce, kind of cathartic argument in the car. And it is partly because you're stuck there. You can't get out of the car if you're on the highway. Unless you do a ladybird and you jump out the side.
Right.
So it's a really potent space in that way.
And I think your axiom that you drive a child a long distance and eventually that you'll have a conversation you wouldn't have had otherwise. The corollary to that is you want to constantly offer to drive your teenagers and their friends anywhere. Because they all sit in the back, and they treat you, after 2 miles, it's like you're dead. They don't even notice. It's amazing.
And then you can
just
listen.
drive, you're really quiet, you don't say anything. And they just talk, and it's like, this is so great, So you'll be able to do that later.
That happened to me for the first time recently. My son is 8 and a half. And I volunteered to take him and his friend to a birthday party. It was far away, and the other mom was going to pick them up, so we split it up. And I had the two of them in the back, and it was like having two little stoners in the back. I had no idea that all this stuff was on their minds. They were like, his friend goes, did you know that if you sent someone back a minute behind you in the past, you would never see that person again? And I was just driving the car, and my son goes, Yeah, but if you think about, if you sent a kid into the future, just 1 second, in 1 second, you would be that kid. And then in another second, that kid would be your past. And they both kind of sat there in awe for a while. I was like, I have to drag you guys more places. Well, I want to ask you about sort of the element of surprise, so to speak, because I didn't know this, that you are an outliner and that you kind of plan everything out. And once I hear that, it makes total sense, because your books are like these sort of intricate, like watches, like, one little thing ticks, and everything that happens by the time you get to the end will have ticked around again. It will have told twice, right? But I'm curious, when you say that you've plotted everything out, do you get surprised when you write still when that happens? I mean, tell me more about the outline. Like, how much do you really know? Do you really know, like, okay, this thing, we're going to have this goal and it's going to function here? Like, have you plotted it out to that effect? How much do you discover?
It's very detailed, the outline. I mean, it's 50 pages or 40 pages. I mean, it's lots and lots of information, chapter by chapter, every character, their background, every setting in detail, every event, some of the imagery, some of the stuff. But it's absolutely about surprise, and then most of I kind of think of it as the quickening, where you're bringing the book to life. That's all surprise. You can start with this outline, but to have that experience where you're reading and you're like, oh yeah, this really feels like it's happening, or that person said the right thing at the right moment, or whatever. That's almost always coming out of the process of the writing. And there's versions of that which are event based. Like the character does something you didn't anticipate.
Right.
And Rules of Civility for me, that was this troublemaking character, Eve. It's like, I'm going home to Chicago. I'm leaving New York. I'm going home to my family in Chicago. And I was literally writing the scene where she's like on the train on the way to Chicago. And suddenly it was like, she would never get off that train to go to her family in Chicago. And so she goes to Hollywood instead by herself. And it was like that was not in the plan.
Yeah.
But to me, one of my favorite aspects of the writing process is that when a reader comes to me and says, oh, this sentence was, or this paragraph, or whatever, it was so great. It meant something much to me, or I thought it was so whatever, wise, or I wrote it down on paper, or I sent it to my daughter, or whatever, that kind of thing. 99% of the time, when somebody comes to me with that sentence, that observation in the book, I would never have had that observation in the course of my normal life. I would never say it to my children. I wouldn't think of it myself. It wouldn't ever occur to me to have that reflection. And what's happened is that you take the book and you're describing a person who you are not. You are working very intimately with your character, but you are not that character. It's not your background, not your personality. And then you put that character in a situation that you've never been in. And suddenly, in the course of as the situation is unfolding, that person says, the thing about life, da 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 da. And usually it comes really fast. And usually I'm like, well done, Count. Nailed that,
I was thinking that
That's what it feels
twist
like.
moment where like all of a sudden the puppet says something and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
I didn't do that, but cool, great.
And that has that rush of surprise.
Yeah.
You're like, oh yeah, that's and that's the gift from the creative process sort of back to you.
Yeah. I think so. Related question: how do you approach getting to know your characters so that you know them really well, and then you sort of you've created the character, and then you kind of push them out into this on stage and you put the scenario. How do you get to know them in the first place?
So I dwell a lot, and that's really it's about for me. I keep imagining different situations and different aspects of their past or what they might do or what they would say under a certain circumstance, all kind of before writing the book.
And do you write that down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that kind of ends up as notes in my notebook, or then that comes in. It works its way into the outline as details. But when I set out to write Rules of Civility, Chapter 1, when I'm sitting down, I know a lot about Kitty. And when I set out to write General Moscow, I know a lot about the Count. But there's something about, again, this sort of quickening of getting the tone right, sort of combination of the way the language would be used and the personality would show through the words. That I have a sense of, but I don't have it totally right until I'm writing Chapter 1. And it's always, I can tell you kind of the sentence where it happens. And in General Moscow, I remember very vividly, it's in the first chapter, the Count gets sentenced to house arrest, and the two red guards, march him across Red Square through the doors of the hotel, and they cross the lobby, and they're approaching the elevator and stairs, and the Count stops, and he turns to the two soldiers and says, "Gentlemen, the lift or the stairs? And they kind of look at each other like unsure what to do, and he thinks to himself, how can you be expected to succeed in the field of battle if you can't make a decision between whether to take the lift or the stairs? So he makes the decision on their behalf, and he says the stairs. And he takes the stairs 2 steps at a time, as had been his habit since the academy. And I remember those 3 sentences were like, very fast. And I stopped, and like, period. And you're like, that's the guy. And that's what I felt like. I was like, there's so many things about that little passage that are informative to me. Like the fact that he would stop and ask his captors, which way should we go? And this kind of overly self-important thing of, how's he supposed to, succeed on the field of battle if you can't make a decision between the...
And then he's going to jump to action.
Yeah, and taking the stairs 2 steps at a time as had been his habit since the academy. I'm like, that gives me so much information about, not biographical information, but sort of tonal information about what kind of personality I'm dealing with, how he's going to describe things, how the world will seem to him. And then, he's going to change a lot over the course of the book and go through a lot of different things and evolve, but that's kind of the starting point that where I get that character thing. But also, what about you? Where do you get your character?
It's very much the same. I always say that I kind of get to know the characters like I'm meeting somebody at a cocktail party where you start off just making very polite conversation. And you say like, okay, what's your name? Where do you live? Where do you work? And then you start getting more like, okay, so do you, what kind of TV shows do you watch? Do you watch Game of Thrones? Or you don't watch Game of Thrones. Why don't you watch Game of Thrones? And you start to get a sense of who they are. And I write that down, and I call it notes as well, because that's my way of tricking myself.
But it's going like this. You're getting deeper into that person.
You're sort of drilling down. Yeah. Or maybe a better way is, like, I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was a kid. In some ways, I feel like you were digging up the stuff that is there.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing, important moments. I'm writing, things that happened to them, or times that they were really embarrassed, or, the time when they had, whatever comes to mind about them. And this is, again, how I trick myself into doing it. I'm like, this won't go in the book. It'll be totally fine. But a lot of that does work its way into the book, and a lot of it doesn't. But for me, it is a matter of sort of figuring out what these personalities are, and then once I've got them, when you know someone really well, like you said, if you know your sister really well, you're like, I know what she would do in this situation. It's a little bit like that.
Yes, right.
And so I think of them as getting these sort of, I guess, combustible elements kind of together, and then I put them all together, and I kind of watch them run at each other.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I think about it. And that's how the plot comes out for me. It comes through the character.
Driven by the people and who they are and what they need. And
yeah, very much.
So how does surprise work for you then?
So I know the characters, but I don't always know what they're going to do. So I generally have 1 or 2 kind of major plot points in mind, and I don't even think of those plot points. I just think of them as sort of like chunks. It's like, I think I'm going here, and then I think we're going over there. And sometimes we do, but my job is to kind of push the characters in that direction, and how they get there is almost always a surprise to me. And so I don't know, for example, I didn't know that, these 2 characters were going to, have a relationship with each other, but they kept finding their way, to each other. In my first novel, Everything I Never Told You, I thought it was going to be a novel about this nuclear family. And I wanted that. I wanted it to feel very, almost claustrophobic, really insular. They feel that they're trapped with each other. And then this neighbor kid kept showing up. Jack kept showing up. And so I would write these scenes where, the brother and sister, Nathan and Lydia, are outside playing, they're young children. And then this neighbor boy walked over and offered them some candy, and I didn't know where he'd come from. And so this is the trust part, where I can go, well, let me follow this through and see where it goes. And for some reason, he and Nate did not get along. And then, they would go somewhere else, and, this neighbor kid just kind of kept showing up. There's a funeral, and he shows up as well, and he's kind of loitering in the trees. And then I feel like my job is to sort of play therapist to my own subconscious and go, okay,
what's he doing?
That's it. I'm like, why is this kid in the story? Clearly my subconscious wants him to be in the story, so what is his job? And I feel like that's the weird thing about being a writer, is you have to sort of trust your instincts, and then at a certain point you then have to go back and kind of justify why those things are there, why your instincts are pushing you. And so I realized he's an outsider to this family. He's always watching them from afar. There are reasons that he's been watching them, because there are certain things about this family that he really envies or that he really cares about. So there's surprise all the time for me. I'm really envious of the outline. I wish I could do that. So I mostly just feel like I'm you're in a dark room, and you're like, well, let's just wander in this direction for a while and see if we run into anything. You're like, okay, I ran into the wall. Well, let's turn around and maybe we'll go somewhere else. It's a very inefficient process.
It's comforting. Yeah. that's the surprise, the version, extension of what you're describing with Jack is, for me, that often happens in a way that I really love, which is in like the second or third revision, because I'll write the draft, and then I'll kind of get some feedback, I'll retreat, I'll think about it, and then I'll go work from beginning to end twice. And one of the big aspects, particularly like of round 2, is sometimes smaller characters start to assert themselves. Where they're like taking I'm carving back the central characters, passages, paragraphs, chapters. They're overdoing it in a way. But meanwhile, the big characters are demanding to be in a different scene. I should have been in the room. That kind of thing. And like the seamstress in Gentleman Moscow plays a very small part, but each draft she got bigger and bigger and bigger and more influential and more. She's
got a very distinct personality.
Yes, right. She's just demanding to be heard. But that's kind of a fun kind of surprise thing for me too. It's when that character surfaces the bit one and demands more attention.
That happens to me in Little Fires Everywhere as well, and I kind of embraced it as this idea that, everyone is going to get kind of like a little moment holding the microphone. We're going to pass it around, and some people will have a lot more airtime than others, but there will be the bailiff at the courtroom, or the taxi driver is going to have just a moment of thinking of what he's saying, or the downstairs neighbor who he's not an important part of the plot, but we're going to get a little flash of insight, and I like the idea, and I feel like you did this so well in your book, that all these people, maybe we're mostly focused on the Count and, on this girl and some other people who come into the story. I'm trying not to ruin anything. But there's an idea that even if we see somebody just for a second, they've got this whole other life. We're just getting a very small slice. They're walk-on. But they walk off, and maybe they're the star of their own show. They're, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Like they're a very small part in Hamlet, but then they walk off and they walk into their own play where they're the center of attention. And it's.
I agree with you 100%. And I part of the reason I want to investigate them and the later thing is there's a great economy to it. In the sense you've built all these relationships, and they've watched the whole thing, like you're saying. They're a bit part. We know who they are. They've seen all this thing. So to suddenly get their perspective in one page, they could drastically change the way you view the whole story. Yeah. And it brings a lot of energy in very concisely into a fixed narrative.
It's also, I think, very democratizing. One of the reviews of my book said that she felt like the omniscient voice that I used was sort of very democratic, and I had never thought of it that way, but I liked it so much that now I'm using it. I'm telling all of you now.
I use the democratic omniscience.
Yes, I'm like, it's democratic. But there's something to that in the idea that you say that everybody's viewpoint sort of is valid of getting some attention. Yeah. And in some ways, it's like, if you've been with one character for a long time, if you've been with the Count or you've been with this person, to get somebody else's sort of flash of insight allows you to see them in a really different way. And at least for the Count, I feel like he's often getting his ego, when just his ego starts to puff up a little too much, somebody will poke back. In a very satisfying way.
Yeah, right. That's true.
He's never, that was one of the things I wanted to ask you, is that he's the hero of the story, ostensibly, and I think he is, but there are many moments in which I think he's made to very gently be the fool in kind of a loving way.
Right.
And I think that prevents him from being insufferable, right? Which he could very easily be.
Absolutely.
He's very wealthy, he's very privileged, right? They didn't kill him. They decided instead of shooting him, they're going to let him live in this lovely hotel, right? He has a lot of privilege, and yet he is kind of humble in that way. Did you do that on purpose, or
And that grew over the course of the writing, but yes, I kind of knew that like, particularly because they introduced the young girls that are going to be friends of his, and I know that, because I have a daughter myself, that they're going to be rug pullers, constantly, just when he thinks, he's on firm, standing and saying, they're going to, and he's going to be like on his back, and so yes, I knew that kind of that would be a part of the thing, but what I didn't know when I began writing the first chapter was, I think the book has a lot of humor in it, and definitely has more in it than I intended it to have. This is nowhere in my outline does it say, this is the funny part here. Like, it doesn't say that. But so like in the writing, I'm like, I was like, oh, this is hilarious, and then I'm like, oh, really? That's I can't put that in there. I'm like, oh, no, definitely put that in there. You gotta do that kind of thing. And so like kind of the humor kind of comes out of it, but I think it's a humanizing force in a productive way, so that you can kind of get the high-minded aspects of the Count, as you say, without him driving you crazy, which he could, for sure.
Absolutely.
Should we turn to the floor?
I can't see the actual cloth that's in here, but so there are two
There's roving mics. And do we have
roving in theory? Oh,
the Politics Prose team is coming.
Yes. So raise your hand and they will come to you. Be patient. Can I ask you, while they're finding it, can I ask you one other thing? Did you always intend to include the footnotes, which I very much enjoyed in the book? Was that
Pretty early on, yes.
What made you decide to use the footnotes?
Because I needed another voice. Most of the book is told from the perspective of the Count, even though it's third person, it's very closely tied to his personality and what he sees. And I wanted this other voice, which is less optimistic, more cynical, more experienced with the Russia of the times, to kind of step in. And that's the role of the footnotes.
All right, have we got mics?
First person.
One of the things that was mentioned earlier is that both of your books are being adapted for television, which strikes me as a process that kind of necessarily requires kind of ceding interpretation to other people, to actors and writers and directors. And I was wondering if that has changed your relationship with the book, made you rethink certain things or feel particularly attached to or less attached to something in what you previously wrote.
You want to go first?
You're farther along, so you go ahead.
I don't know. So Little Fires Everywhere, actually both novels are hopefully being adapted into films, but Little Fires Everywhere is being adapted by Reese Witherspoon and Kerry Washington, who are going to produce and star. It's going to be an 8-part miniseries on Hulu. And so far it's been great. My husband keeps asking me, so are you feeling protective yet? Is that kind of instinct kicking in? And honestly, the answer so far is no. Part of it is because I'm really fortunate to have a team of people working on the book whose interpretation I trust. And so they are doing certain things that will be different. One of the things that I'm learning is when you expand a novel into a miniseries, you actually get to add in more. If you're making a feature film, you actually have to cut quite a bit because you've only got maybe 2.5 hours. There's a lot you have to pare away. But with this, they're able to kind of tease out what's already there. And so events that are covered in a sentence of backstory, we may now get to see dramatized. They're making a couple other little tweaks, which I've actually been really in favor of when they tell me, they're sort of like, okay, we think you're gonna like this. And I've loved the ideas that they have. But I think part of it also is that I went into the adaptation thinking, like you said, this is going to be somebody else's interpretation and wanting that. My favorite interpretations and my favorite adaptations are the ones where you really see a different spin on it. And so, for example, like Clueless as a retelling of Emma, that kind of thing where you can take it pretty far. And for me, some of the fun is seeing how different it can be and still be recognizable. I think about cover songs. And for me, the best cover songs are where it's maybe got a really different tone or it's really got a really different anything to it, and yet you know that it's the same song at heart. So I went into it really thinking about it as I want this thing to get to be its own thing. Like the book will always be there. Like I always wrote that book, and so I'm kind of curious to see how it goes. So tell us where you are in yours. I just learned about it today.
You're very wise. I wish I had all that. So we have we're kind of parallel situations. General Moscow is being turned into a 12-hour miniseries on one of the 3 major streaming services, which I can't disclose, and it will star Kenneth Branagh as the Count. And for me, I think the biggest thing was there was great interest by an actor who I adore to do it, but he wanted to do it as a feature film, and I was just like I couldn't do it. That was a place where I said I just don't think. For the reasons Celeste said, the carving back I thought would ruin the book. And actually, when we started with Branagh and the director, the screenwriter, the plan was 6 hours. And kind of at the last minute, as contracts were about to be signed, the streaming people came back and said, "Could you do 12?" And I was like, "Definitely." Well, sure. And this is actually really true. So you hang up. That was like, you're like, great, we're all set. Next day, phone rings. 12? Absolutely, that's a great idea. Phone ring. Next day, phone rings. How about 5 years? I was like, what? No, you can't do it over 5 years. That would be terrible. They're like, okay. So you're kind of trying to get that. But yeah, for me, the biggest thing was knowing that it would have enough length to do the book justice was very comforting. In my case, I did end up talking my way into, I didn't want to write the episodes, partly because I didn't want to go through the emotional turmoil the collaborative process. Because the thing about writing novels, which is almost unique in the arts, is the contract that you would have with a major publisher basically says that if they publish your book and you take their money, you have to consider what they have to say.
Yeah.
And that's it.
You don't have to take your editor's comments. You don't have to take and it's just you.
Yeah.
Like it's just you in the room. And so if you're like, I am going to add in a beautiful prose poem interlude here for 75 pages. You can do that. And people might try and talk
I'm going to split every infinitive in the book. So whatever. So you do it. But yes, of course, in Hollywood, it's literally today, the producers have input, the money has input, the directors, the actors now can change the scripts. That's in their contracts.
Especially if it's a big star.
Especially if it's a big star.
They're like, she's not going to like that, so we got to change it.
And if you have a couple of stars, then you're really in trouble, because then they're arguing about how much minutes they get, and who should win the fight on screen, and blah, blah, who should date who, and it's like, what are we talking about?
There are I think actually 5 different production companies technically involved, because recently they each have their own. Hulu has one, AMC, or ABC, is involved in it, and then there's someone else who I'm forgetting.
Yes,
they all have to agree, and the odds of getting anybody to agree on one thing, you realize how many cooks are in the kitchen.
So what I did is I talked myself into being involved in the creation of the Bible. And for those of you who don't know, the Bible in TV basically is a short document, it might be 20 pages, where it describes what happens in every episode. So in essence, it's saying, what's the overall arc? Every episode, what is the key event, and then how does it play out over the course of the 12 hours or whatever. And I sort of felt like, if I can get in that room and spend a couple of weeks doing that with the team, then it's sort of, and I, as you say, you got to trust everybody, or you wouldn't have said yes, and then you just have to kind of let it happen as it happens. And I am going to be furious later, for sure. It's going to drive me crazy, but that's what it is.
That's what it is. Sorry. I don't know where the microphone is. Okay, yes, hi.
This is a little bit of a sidebar, but I was just wondering if you have visited the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where there's this refrigerator-sized cabinet of curiosities in miniature.
Oh.
I just thought it might be something.
Thank you for telling me this. I leave tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning.
And I also, you can also have a couple of really wonderful GMTs at Jose Andres' restaurant before you do that.
In the morning.
This is good to know. Very good to know. Thank you. I feel like we called on this lady down here, and then we coolly we sit back down.
Right here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you studied English literature, and then you did 20 years in finance, and then you found your way back to writing.
Right.
So could you talk to us a little bit about how you did that, and how the both of you, and why you did that, and how you found your way back to it, and how the both of you kept the creativity alive, with your day-to-day jobs and your day-to-day life, and just sort of didn't get lost in your finance world, or just in general kept skills.
And it's a different track for the two of us, as was said at the opening. So for me, I began writing fiction as a kid. I wrote in high school, I wrote in college, I wrote in graduate school. So that's always been my passion, my ambition, my sense of who I was. But yes, when I moved to New York, I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm, and 20 years later, we were still working side by side. And that was a great choice in its own way. But so for me, the big people say, well, how did you must have really wanted to write so badly, or how did you make the time for it, or whatever. And it's actually kind of, for me, it was the reverse in a way. It wasn't so much what I desired to do in a way as what I feared would happen if I didn't do it. What I mean by that is that, and I said this when I proposed to my wife, it's kind of crazy. I was like, if you marry me, I'm not going to cheat on you. I'm not going to go broke. But if I'm 50 and I haven't written a book that I feel, happy about, proud about, I will probably become bitter and a drinker. Now I'm just a drinker. But that for me was very real. This sense, so I knew that there was a sense of urgency that I kind of stopped writing for a decade while we were getting the firm really going. And I kind of knew as that clock was ticking, if I don't get back and start doing this, it's going to be a real problem for me personally. and my family. So eventually I'm like, okay, it's time. I gotta start. So when I was 30, I started writing. It took me 7 years to write my first novel, and I finished it, and I hated it. And so, I set that aside, and I went back to the drawing board, and then I ended up writing Rules of Civility. And then when that became a bestseller, I quit my job. But it was very much about, it's what I wanted to do. And so then you just try to figure out when you can carve out the time. And I think this is, by the way, one of the reasons that I'm such an obsessive outliner, is because having the job and kids and trying to write the book, the only way I could do it was if I had a very strong outline. And the failed 7-year book did not have one. And that's what went wrong. Because I didn't have the time to I needed to know where I was every time I sat down. Because I was only going to get a chance to sit down and have 2 or 3 hours once every 6 days, let's say. And so then I really needed to know, okay, where am I? So I can be productive right then at that moment. So that's what it was for me.
Yeah, I took a different path. I took the sort of more, what used to be considered the more traditional path of going to grad school and getting a Master of Fine Arts, and then being poor and working side jobs for a while I was finishing the book. But at heart, it's basically the same story as Amor's, which is that I wrote a lot as a kid. I was writing stories when I was really little. I would write plays, and I would make my cousins perform them, and then we would charge our parents admission, and we would split it. And they've not forgotten this. Every time I see them, they're like, so we get a cut of all of your proceeds, right? But I always it was sort of like a compulsion. For me, writing is the way that I figure stuff out. Not necessarily specific issues in my life, but often just what I think about things. Like, I'm always figuring that out on the page. And so I wrote through high school and I wrote through college, and I always had this idea that being a writer was not an actual job. It may be because I'm the child of immigrants and my parents are both scientists and very practical by nature, but I knew that you need money to pay rent and buy food and have clothing and things like that. And so I always had this idea that I would do something else and I would write on the side. And so for a while it was be a paleontologist and then write on the side. And then it would be an astronaut and then write on the side. And then I turned 10 and I realized it's not a really viable career choice. And then it became, sort of be a journalist and write on the side. And then I realized that I don't have personality to be a journalist. And so it became work in publishing. And I did do that. I did internships, and then I, worked at a travel writing company, and I finally started working in publishing, I think the September after I graduated from college. And by that October, so 1 month later, I knew that this had been a terrible mistake. It was just not the right field for me. And at that point, a teacher of mine who had become a mentor was like, you always say you're doing the writing on the side. Why don't you just try for a limited period of time putting the writing in the front instead of on the side?
See what happens.
And see what happens. And she said, why don't you think about getting an MFA? And I said, what is an MFA? So she explained to me what that was, and I got really fortunate that I got accepted into a writing program, which turned out to be a great fit. But I think the bigger question of just sort of how, if you have this thing that you feel compelled to do, and I think if you have the writing bug in you, you kind of know this about yourself. I think it's a question of sort of shaping your life where you can carve out some time and recognizing that it might take a long time, but trusting that it will happen. And so it might be that, like you said, you get maybe you get one evening every week, or an hour every Sunday, or it's only, one of my professors, Peter Hodavies, said that he wrote his first novel in about 20-minute segments while his son, who was a very poor napper, was sleeping. So he would just write 20 minutes and then his son would wake up and he'd have to stop and then he'd come back. And so he wrote this in 20 minutes. And I found that so reassuring because in some ways it's said that as long as you keep chipping at it, you will eventually get to where you need to go.
Right.
All right.
There.
Oh, okay, yes.
I have a question that follows on quite well with that one, which is time seems to be such a critical issue for writing. How do you prioritize reading? And do you try to keep up with your contemporary authors? Or do you go back to look at historical writing? Or what do you read? Read.
For me, reading is sort of the flip side of writing for me, and often if the writing is not going, I know that it means that I need to start reading some stuff. And so I read pretty widely. I read nonfiction as well as fiction, but I do try and keep up with sort of what's going on because I like being part of the conversation in literary fiction today. And so if I hear about a book and it sounds interesting, I'll pick it up and read it. And I'm lucky because I happen to be a fairly fast reader. And so I can read a book in a couple of days if I'm giving it my attention. I do, though, go back and read classics because I think there's something to that. So books that I've read before, I will go back and kind of reverse engineer them in some ways to pick apart how they did it. If there's something that they did, I want to do that. I will go back and kind of study it. And then I think it's just good also to have a grounding in the classics. So this past year, I had sort of a fun project of just plugging holes in my education. Like I had never read Middlemarch. And so I read part of it in order to take the GRE in English literature, and then I hadn't quite finished it by the time the test came, so I took the test and then I stopped. And I went back and I really enjoyed it. And then I went back and I read Anna Karenina for the first time, and then so I was filling in these little holes that for some reason I had missed, and I don't know yet how it's going to find its way into my writing, but I think that it will. Like I'm confident that all sort of goes. It's like a compost heap in there. It goes in there, and it sits for a while, and then eventually it will turn into something new.
I read with 3 friends, and so there's 4 of us, 2 men, 2 women. We're all married, but none of our spouses are involved. And we started reading together 15 years ago. So, and we read a novel a month, and we do projects. So we'll do. And we read mostly dead authors, mostly, with some few exceptions. So like we'll do things like we read, one year we did Dickinson, Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, and then read 5 of the novels of Mark Twain, and then 6 by Faulkner, in kind of this American narrative thread. And then like another year we did Cervantes, Don Quixote 1 and 2, and then we did Borges, and then we did 6 novels of 5 or 6 of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and then we did a bunch of the novels of Bolaño. Again, sort of this sort of Latin, strange Latin thread. And so we'll kind of pursue things like that. And it takes a year to do a project, and that's been a lot of fun. We did 7 Philip Roth novels 2 years ago. We did 6 Toni Morrison novels last year. Both very satisfying to take an author and move chronologically through their work. And because you kind of, again, like you're saying, you see things.
Patterns.
You see the evolution of their narrative style, their themes, the way they're using images. It can really start to resonate in a way. And we read very closely to try to understand, as you say, how is he or she doing this? Why is she doing it? How does it work and why does it work? And right now we're reading, which is amazing, is Paul Scott's The Jewel in the Crown, which is 4 novels about the end of the empire, the British Empire in India, starting in like the mid-30s and ending shortly after the end of the Second World War. Written in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and but it's an amazing series of books. So that's what we did.
Okay.
So I'd like to talk about setting for a second. For me, when I read a novel, setting is very important for me to be able to picture something in my mind. I grew up near Cleveland, Ohio, so your novels, for me, really speak to me because I can picture, especially in Little Fires Everywhere, exactly where Shaker Heights is, and even in your first novel, a fictional town in Ohio that's very close to where I grew up. A hotel in Moscow, on the other hand, I kind of think of the Grand Budapest Hotel and kind of picture something like that in my mind. These are obviously very different settings. How do you guys pick these? I understand you grew up in Ohio, but I understand you probably did not grow up in a hotel in 1922. So if you could tell me a little bit about that, I'd be very interested.
For me, of course, setting is an element of craft, right? And the novel is as an art form, is one which is bringing together many different elements of craft, that any student knows, and some that you don't think about. But, whether it's the plot, the individual characters, the use of poetics and metaphor, the structure itself. These are the dialogue, thematic delivery. These are all each one of these is a different element of craft that over time you're trying to master, and you're trying to master it in such a way that you can do it in different styles depending on the different stories you need to tell. And so setting is just one of those elements of craft, but it's a very important one, certainly. And in Rules of Civility, it's the city of New York in a certain way. And in General Moscow, it's the building of the hotel. And those are very different challenges from the setting standpoint. But in the case of the General in Moscow, I knew that since 90% of the book takes place inside the walls of the hotel, I really wanted the readers to be able to kind of navigate the hotel as early as possible. So there was a lot of time and effort in both the writing and the editing to sort of make sure that in 100 pages or so that the reader would be like, oh, I know where I am. Okay, we're in the staircase, we're in the grand dining room, and then I know that if I go left, I'm going to end up in the bar, some version of that. And you got to be careful, because if you kind of lay it out really pedantically in the beginning, you know who's going to finish the book, And so you have to write it in such a way they absorb the place, its details, its sense of atmosphere, in a way, the physical layout. And so you build on that. Now, I'll take a quick side note, and then I'll pass the mic to you, which is that the Hotel Metropole is a real hotel in Moscow. And I was there not long ago, and the first pages of the book, the count is in a fancy suite on the 3rd floor, and when they sent us in the house arrest, they take him out and they put him in an attic room on the 6th floor of the hotel, so an abandoned attic room. And I was at the hotel, and the manager, who's a Swiss guy, is terrific, and I said, hey, we've become friends since the publication of the book, and they said, how's it going? He said, oh, so excited. We have people coming from America and Europe come to the hotel and for the book. It's really great. I said, oh, that's terrific. He said, yeah. I said, well, yeah, the only thing is, oh, you know what? He said, well, everybody who comes wants to go to the 6th floor. There is no 6th floor. And that's great. I love that. So on the one hand, you're trying to get, wasn't my goal was to create a precise version of the hotel as it stands. It's to create a version of the hotel that you can see in your mind and that serves the interests of the tale. And both, not only from a plot, but a thematic standpoint, personality standpoint, and all this other stuff. And I love the fact that the Count spends his entire time living in the 6th floor of the hotel, which does not exist. That's the way it should be.
Yeah, I think what you said about, does it serve the purposes of the novel, I think is exactly the right way to think about it. Because for me, the setting, I think about, much like character, it has to have some reason for being in the novel, and it should, in some ways, be interacting with the characters and with the themes of the novel. So in Everything I Never Told You, I told you before, I wanted this to be about a nuclear family. I wanted it to be very claustrophobic. I wanted it to feel like a small place. And so I had to make up a small town for them that was going to be, I think I said it was between Toledo and Cleveland, because there's not a lot in between Toledo and Cleveland. And so it was in some ways a place where they could be isolated. I needed these characters to feel like they were sort of on this little island by themselves. In my initial conception of this book, I thought, oh, maybe they'll be in Boston, because I had just come from Boston to grad school. And I realized that wasn't going to work, because in some ways Boston was going to be too big of a city for them. It was going to have too much space for them. It might in some ways be too accommodating and accepting for them, and I needed to put them in a space where they would feel really alone. And so I made up this little space where I could kind of say, here's all the parameters where you really are, they live on a cul-de-sac, And so in that way I had to develop the setting like it was a character. In Little Fires Everywhere, the book really rose out of wanting to write about Shaker Heights, which is my hometown, and wanting to kind of explore the weirdnesses of it, both good and bad, all the ways that it is not quite like other towns. And it ended up, I think, functioning as the right place to tell a story about a family that, like the town, thinks it has got it all together and is about to find out that actually does not have everything all together. It's actually, got huge blind spots that it missed. The setting in that way, I think, sort of has the same arc that the characters have. It sort of feeds into that same dynamic.
Hi. You mentioned it briefly about drafts 2 and 3, but I was wondering if you could both talk about your revision process, because I imagine it's fairly different coming from an outline-based start, and then Celeste, you sort of, as you described, stumbling around in the dark to find the story sometimes.
I think my revision process it's very messy, because I do the wandering around in the dark room kind of method. What I tend to do is I don't know often what the story is until I've finished a first draft. And so I'm working on my next book now, and I have friends who are writers, and when I complain to them, they very helpfully go through their emails, and they find the emails that I've sent to them while writing previous drafts, and say, okay, here's what you said to me when you were writing, everything I never told you. I don't know how these are going to fit together. It's not possible to write this book. All the things, and they kind of mirror that back to me, which is sort of a helpful reminder that this is just how my process seems to go. That I write the first draft, and I look at it, and I go, oh, that's what I'm talking about. That's what the story is. And then I can take out the parts that don't fit and kind of rearrange the parts that need to be there into the right order. But it's very piecemeal for me. It involves a lot of moving things around, and for the writing of the second book, I moved from working in Microsoft Word to this other program that allows you to kind of just move pieces around within a document, and it's been really helpful because that seems to be part of my process.
Fascinating. For me, I don't share, so when I write my first draft, I don't mean in the general sense, but I don't share what I'm writing, so my first draft, nobody sees it until I'm done, and then I give it to 6 people on the same day, and I basically ask them to give me feedback within 60 days, and I have a series of 6 lunches where I meet with each of them and hear what they have to say, and that's a chance for me, and one of those is my editor, one of those is my agent. I have several friends who are very good readers, and they're on that list, and then I kind of release me to kind of take in different thoughts they have, or, this part's slow, I don't like this, I don't understand this character's behavior, or, why did this happen, or this is unbelievable, whatever. You get this kind of laundry list of feedback. And then I kind of retreat with that. And I sort of design, what am I going to do in round 2? How am I going to address some of these issues and improve the book, make it sharper, make it richer. And so that's kind of, I shrink the book. Like if it's 350 pages, I edit it down to, say, 290 or something, and then I start to add material in. So the shrink from 350 to 290 is everything that was in the 350 is still there, it's just more economical. But then I start to carefully put in new elements and work my way back up to 350 pages in essence with this a richer book. And then I do that a second time. That's kind of a crazy process.
I think anytime you get authors to describe their process, it's always like I know people who are like, and then I cut the manuscript into pieces, and then I lay it out. I mean, I know people who do that, and it is. I think part of it is how you get your head around this.
We're all very different too. Every person I talk to is a little different, but I love that when you're describing this Eric Larson, which you may know Eric Larson's work in nonfiction. He's an amazing narrative nonfictionist, but he literally lays it all out like in his apartment. So it drives his wife crazy. Yeah. This point when it gets where he's like, I got all the material, I got to lay it out, honey. It's like the whole place, up and down the hallways, because it's stacks of like 5 pages that he doesn't necessarily know what the order it's going to go in yet. And he has to lay it all out to figure that out.
Everybody does something different, and every time I hear someone else's process, I kind of like get like hives. Just thinking about like Lauren Groff, who's a novelist and a friend. Her process apparently is she writes out her first draft by hand in a notebook, and as long as it takes, and then she throws it away, and she starts writing it on the computer. And her idea is, I know it's kind of like I get like really uncomfortable just thinking about that. But her theory, as she says it, is that whatever, in some ways that's the rough draft, and whatever was really important will kind of still be with her, and then all the other stuff kind of disappears, but it just makes me wildly uncomfortable.
I would not have the courage for that.
That's it, and I was like, do you do that? I think she does. I don't think she says that, but she does.
Now it's almost 8:30, you guys have been very generous with your time. Do we have time for one more question?
One more question, or? Okay, make a really good one. Who is a really good
one? Okay, this is a lot of pressure for me to pick a really good one.
Really good question.
I'm just curious if there's any style of writing that you want to try that you haven't tried yet. And what would that be, or what scares you, possibly?
Well, I would say that I'm scared of screenwriting and playwriting because I don't think that dialogue is one of my strengths. And it's kind of important for screenplay and plays. Most of it is dialogue. I'm learning, I got to go and sit in the writer's room, and I learned that they have a whole different way of thinking about structure. They're like, okay, so the first beat is this and this, and they divided it into acts, and they're collaborative, and I was really happy to see it, but I don't think that that'll ever be my method of writing, just because it's so different. I'm used to being alone in a quiet room and kind of like daydreaming and going down a lot of dead ends, and they're very efficient in sort of figuring out how they do it. So for me, I don't know if I'll ever try that. I don't know, what about you? That was the opposite of what you asked, wasn't it?
The Rules of Civility, John Musker, are very different places. They're set over different periods of time, with different types of characters, and that's going to keep being true for me. I like to keep shifting it and trying to do a new type of storytelling for me. Because a different type of character, a different setting with different issues requires a different language, in essence, to tell that tale. And that's part of the fun, is to kind of find what's the right poetics for this story. And but a kind of rather extreme current example is I got a call from an acquaintance who I'd met in the industry, who's a well-known young science fiction writer. And he said, hey, I've been commissioned to write this, to edit an anthology of science fiction stories, and I got the guy who did The Martian and the woman who did Divergent, and would you be interested in writing a science fiction story for us? And I was like, what? What? And he's like, no, I kind of think it'd be really cool to see it. And I was like, yeah. So my rule with that kind of thing is I say, I'll call you in 24 hours. And I hang up the phone, and if in 24 hours I know exactly what I do, I will consider it. If I don't know what I'm going to do, I say, no way. Because there's nothing worse as a writer than feeling like you have a deadline or a clock ticking and you don't know what you're going to say. So, but in this case, I was like, yeah, I knew what I would do. This is what I do. And he's like, great. So in this September, I have a long science fiction short story coming out in this anthology, and it's kind of crazy, But I'm dying to do murder mystery. I can't wait for that. But yes, exploration at all times. Thank you all.